This is my 103rd video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part deals with something I've been meaning to do for some time, fixing up the school playground on my main Hornby layout, using the Gaugemaster Fordhampton Playground kit and model scene sets of schoolgirls and Mistress and schoolboys and master. I bought the Gaugemaster kit and the model scene figures quite a while ago, and I believe I even showed them in a previous video. So I had been intending to do this for quite some time, but recently I've been working on my shelf layout a lot, so this project got rather put aside. The area in the centre here is behind my village school. I didn't think that it made any sense really for it to just be a grassy patch, and I wanted to fix it up to look more interesting as a playground for the school. I built the school from the Super Quick Village School card kit B31, and you can see my build of that in detail in part 48 of this series. I'd separated an area behind the school with walls and a hedge to form a yard, but I hadn't actually done anything with that area, so it was still covered with the static grass that I initially put down in the whole central area. I lifted the school building to make it easier to get at the yard area. My paper template for the school buildings was still underneath. I wanted to remove as much as possible of the grass from the yard so that I could surface it with something else that would look more reasonable as a playground. I took up the template and then scraped off as much of the grass in the yard as I could using a single-edged razor blade. I picked up the debris using my Woodland Scenics model vac. You can see a review of that in part 35 of this series. In taking up the template, I had lifted grass from some spots where I didn't mean to, so I applied a bit of static tack glue and re-grassed those spots. Then I applied static tack glue over the central area of the yard. I sprinkled on Woodland Scenics mid-grey fine ballast, hoping that this would look something like an asphalt yard. Whilst the glue on the layout was drying, I got started on the Gaugemaster kit for the playground equipment. Or should I say the Fowler kit, as the Gaugemaster branding was just on a paper wrapper, and this was the box containing the kit once that paper wrapper was removed. So it would appear that this is a German kit, although it does have other languages on its packaging and printed materials. When unpacked, the kit contained 3 sprues of plastic parts, 1 each in brown, blue and red, and a sheet of instructions primarily in the form of pictures. Part numbers were clearly marked on the instructions and the sprues, making it easy to unambiguously identify the parts needed for each assembly. The part numbers were also 2-part, with the initial part identifying the sprue on which the part would be found, thus making finding the parts simple. Here's the instruction for the first assembly. This will use part 8 from sprue 1, the blue sprue, and part 1 from sprue 3, the brown sprue. Note that the verbal instructions are in German, English, French and Dutch, with the German first, unsurprisingly since this is clearly a German kit. The tyre of the tyre swing came as a blue part, which seemed to make absolutely no sense, so I painted it black. At this point I went back to the layout to see how things were going. I vacuumed off excess ballast with the model vac. I wasn't very happy with the appearance of the yard. I should have used darker ballast. It looked much too light to me. So I painted it with a dirty brown wash. Not sure if this is ideal, but it's better than the initial light grey, I think. Back with the kit, I decided the whole blue and red thing was just entirely unhelpful for the appearance that I wanted, so I spray painted those whole sprues before removing any more parts, spraying one grey and the other metallic silver. This was the next item to be assembled, a sort of roundabout. The instructions implied that you should be able to glue the end of the centre from the top to the top of the pin coming from the bottom, so making the thing rotate. This wouldn't work, as the two centre pins didn't seem to be long enough to meet inside, so you couldn't really glue them together, unless the main base was shaved down, but I didn't really care whether the thing rotated, so I just glued the parts together statically. This was the instruction diagram for the next assembly, the swing set, and this was where things started to get, well, let's say tricky. To be honest, I'd assumed that the assembly of this kit would be trivial, just sticking a couple of little parts together to make the playground items. Actually, it proved to require considerably more care and effort than I expected. The main problem was that many of the parts were so tiny and delicate that just getting them off the sprues without breaking them was a serious challenge in itself, requiring considerable thought and the use of several different tools. And once off the sprues, some of the parts were so delicate that the slightest pressure of any kind would break them, so handling them and gluing them together required considerable care. I only broke one part whilst working on this kit, one of the hangers on this swing, which I broke trying to glue it to the swing seat. I just applied a little too much pressure trying to push the parts together to let the glue take hold, and the hanger snapped. After that I increased my diligence in handling the parts with extreme delicacy. These are all of the parts for the swing set gathered before I broke one of the hangers. The hanger that I broke is the second from the left. You can see the break, but I did manage to repair it fairly successfully. Here's the tyre swing with its tyre attached with a piece of thread. This won't stand up on its own as there's too much weight on one side, so it will have to be glued down in order to stand up. Here's the instruction diagram for the slide. This was probably the most difficult of all to assemble, having extremely delicate parts that needed to be stuck together in ways that weren't simple. The side rails for the ladder seen at bottom here were particularly difficult to get off the sprue without breakage, and also particularly tricky to attach properly. I resorted to chopping the sprues apart with a side cutter before attempting to remove the parts, as this made it easier to get a fine cutter into position to cut the attachment gates. Here are those parts liberated from their sprues and casting pieces. Gluing the ladder to the slide wasn't too hard, as there were reasonably large flat surfaces by which the two parts could be attached, easier upside down like this. Getting that support up the bottom of the slide to stay attached at a reasonable angle was surprisingly awkward. There was no groove or anything to support it. The handrails were the trickiest, needing to be attached by the ends of 4 pins, again with no location holes or anything. I actually ended up using cyanoacrylate glue to attach the superglue, as I couldn't get them to stay in place properly with polycement. Here's the instruction diagram for this sort of swingy roundabout thing. And here are the parts for that. The swing handles were delicate and again required considerable care to detach them from the sprue without breaking them. But in this case there were locator holes into which the handles glued, which made assembly much easier. So there's that thing assembled. Another real train going by outside. Item J is some sort of simple climbing frame. The parts for this required some fiddling around to get them off the sprue and remove their casting pieces. Here are the parts removed and cleaned up. So here are all of the items assembled so far. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to bother with much else. There are a bunch of pipes and some sort of sandpit, but I didn't think I'd use those. I decided that I might as well include this sort of climbing ladder thing. I remember playing on things like this as a boy in England, although I think they had a bit more support than this. This was also quite simple to assemble. These were the 2 sets of figures I'd bought for this exercise. Reasonably suitable, and it's not as if there was a lot of choice in the way of 00 scale school children. Here are those figures taken out of their packaging. Each set contained 5 child figures and 1 adult, all painted. The figures didn't use bases, which makes them more realistic but harder to get to stand in place. So here was everything on the bench at this point. I thought that some things looked too shiny, especially the bases of the swing set. So I did some washing, first applying a dirty brown wash to the swing set bases, and then applying an alcohol-based black wash to all of the equipment. I put the building back to verify where the door was going to come, etc. I carried everything up from the bench to the layout on a tray, since some things were so delicate. I initially tried using Scenic Accents glue, but I found this pretty useless. The claim printed on the pot of instant placement, no holding required is, well, I don't think there's any expression for it but a blatant barefaced lie. The stuff won't hold anything in place other than things that would stay in place anyway without any glue. Anything that actually has a tendency to fall over or move requires a great deal of holding, and even after a great deal of holding is still prone to just fall over. Scenic Accents glue seems to take about 15 minutes to dry, so if you apply a lot of it, applying a little of it achieves nothing, and then hold things in place for 15 minutes or so, it might keep them in place after that. I mostly gave up on the Scenic Accents eventually and switched to CA for anything that really needed to be held in place. I did glue some of the figures just by their feet, mostly with CA. With some I cheated a bit and supported them by leaning them on things. There wasn't room for all of the equipment in my relatively small playground, so I used the items that seemed the most appropriate and the best fit in the playground. I put the tire swing in the garden of the cottage, so that's a private item just for the family children, not part of the school playground, which seems reasonable enough for a tire swing, I think. It was hard to make it look as though the children were actually doing things, but I did my best. I put a couple of items that wouldn't fit into the back playground round the front of the school. I had the master and the mistress up against the school building, supervising. So there we are, not 100% successful, I guess, but worth doing, as it's better than the plain grass area that was there before. And that train is still going by. It's a freight train.